You are obstructing emergency medical care. I am ordering you to step aside. Now move.
That's it, you're done. You're under arrest.
The call came across the radio as a gut punch, a string of words that painted an instant picture of hell. It was 1:47 p.m. on a blistering Tuesday in late May, the kind of Jacksonville heat that felt heavy enough to wear. The air itself seemed to sweat. Imani Washington, her hands steady on the steering wheel of the Jacksonville Fire and Rescue Department's EMS supervisor truck, listened as the dispatcher's voice, strained but professional, cut through the static. All units, respond to a multi-vehicle incident, Fuller Warren Bridge, northbound lanes. Reports of a tanker truck involved, active fire, multiple victims, possible entrapment. Imani keyed the mic, her own voice a stark contrast to the unfolding chaos, a deep, calm alto honed by 28 years of running toward the worst moments of other people's lives. EMS 5 responding, ETA 4 minutes. She was already moving, the heavy-duty truck surging forward. The Fuller Warren wasn't just a bridge, it was a major artery, the 8-lane concrete spine connecting downtown to the south side. A major incident there, especially with a tanker fire, wasn't just a medical emergency. It was a city-stopping catastrophe. She was 50 years old, a woman whose placid, kind face and neatly braided hair belied the steel in her backbone. She had seen everything the city could throw at its citizens, from hurricane aftermaths to shipyard accidents, and she had met all of it with the same unwavering competence. But a tanker fire on the bridge, that was a different kind of beast. As she raced up the on-ramp, a plume of thick, greasy black smoke was already boiling into the otherwise brilliant blue sky, a funeral pyre visible for miles. Traffic was at a dead stop. This was where the supervisor's vehicle, with its aggressive sirens and off-road capabilities, earned its keep. Imani expertly maneuvered onto the wide concrete shoulder, her eyes scanning, processing, formulating a plan before she was even on scene. Her mind was a well-organized library of mass casualty protocols, and she was already pulling the right volumes from the shelves. The scene that greeted her as she crested the bridge's apex was apocalyptic. A fuel tanker lay on its side, a monstrous silver whale breached across 3 lanes of northbound traffic. Angry orange flames licked from a ruptured seam, consuming a late-model sedan that had been crushed against the median. Behind it, a city bus, its front end accordion-pleated from the impact, had slammed into a small fleet of passenger cars. It was a tangled, burning snarl of steel and glass. Miraculously, the bus hadn't caught fire, but the potential for a massive fuel-air explosion from the tanker was terrifyingly real. This was no longer a car crash. It was a hazardous materials incident, a fire scene, and a mass casualty event all rolled into one. It required a conductor, someone to orchestrate the symphony of chaos that was about to descend. That was her job. She brought her truck to a stop a safe distance from the fire, establishing the initial command post. She grabbed her helmet and the weighted orange vest that identified her as EMS Command. The heat was a physical blow, a blast furnace wave that hit her the moment she opened the door. The air was a toxic cocktail of burnt fuel, melting plastic, and superheated asphalt. The roar of the fire was a constant, hungry beast. The first engine company was already on scene, the captain shouting orders as his crew pulled a heavy-duty foam line. Imani met him at a run, their exchange a rapid-fire burst of professional shorthand. "Captain Hayes, what's your assessment?" "Tanker's compromised, but it's diesel, not gas. Less risk of vapor explosion, but the fire's spreading. We've got at least 4 cars involved, plus the bus. We're focusing on exposure protection and knocking down the main body of fire. I've got no count on victims yet." "Understood," Imani said, her eyes already sweeping the entire scene, mentally drawing zones, establishing ingress and egress routes for arriving ambulances. "I'm establishing medical command. I'll set up triage over there on the southbound shoulder, using the fire engine as a shield. I need 2 of your guys to help me check that bus as soon as you can spare them." "You got it, Imani." There was no argument, no question of authority. They had worked together for 2 decades. He commanded the fire, she commanded the medicine. That was the dance. She strode toward the chaos, her movements economical and purposeful. People were staggering away from the wreckage, dazed and bleeding. The walking wounded. She pointed them toward a designated safe area, her voice cutting through their shock. "This way, please. Come over here and sit down. Help is coming." But her focus was on the vehicles, on the ones who couldn't walk away. The first ambulances were arriving now, their sirens dying with a mournful sigh as they joined the growing fleet of emergency vehicles. The paramedics who jumped out looked to her immediately, their eyes asking the silent question, "Where do you need us, Chief?" Imani pointed toward the crushed sedan nearest the fire. "Engine 14 is working the fire. I need a crew to assess that sedan for entrapment as soon as the line is charged. We need to know what we're dealing with." She then directed another crew toward the bus. "Check the bus driver. Assess everyone on board. It's a city bus, should be adults. Start triage in place if you have to." She moved with an unhurried urgency, her presence a calming anchor in the storm. She was a master of this domain, the creator of order from chaos. She saw the entire scene as a complex equation, and she was solving for a single variable, saving as many lives as possible. In these first critical moments, under the oppressive Florida sun and the shadow of the black smoke, she was in total control. She had no idea that her control, her absolute and necessary authority, was about to be challenged by someone who saw the world not as a problem to be solved, but as a stage on which to perform his own power. The next 10 minutes were a masterclass in emergency management. With the fire suppression efforts underway, creating a tenuous buffer against the inferno, Imani's operational plan unfolded with the precision of a military campaign. She directed the arriving ambulance crews, her voice calm and clear over the dedicated radio channel, turning a chaotic collection of individual responders into a cohesive and effective medical force. "Rescue 7, establish the treatment area on the far side of Engine 14. I want separate tarps for red, yellow, and green tags. Rescue 12, you're on standby for transport. Ladder 4, assist Engine 9's crew with extrication at the primary impact zone." Her mind worked like a supercomputer, processing dozens of data streams simultaneously. The shrill, metallic scream of the jaws of life biting into a crushed car door. A paramedic's report from the bus. "EMS 5, we have a dozen passengers on the bus, mostly minor injuries, shock, and smoke inhalation. The driver is unconscious, pinned by the steering column. He's our priority." A firefighter's shout. "We've got a live one in the blue SUV! Heavy entrapment! Looks like both legs!" Imani absorbed it all, her expression never changing. She triaged not just the patients, but her own resources. The bus driver was critical, but the extrication would be complex. The victim in the SUV was also critical, and perhaps more immediately accessible. She made the call. "Rescue 3, focus on the SUV. We need that extrication now. Rescue 9, stage your equipment by the bus. As soon as the driver is free, you're taking him." She moved through the scene, a constant presence of calm authority. She stopped by the green-tagged patients, the walking wounded, who were huddled together, their faces streaked with soot and tears. She spoke to them with a gentle firmness, reassuring them while also gathering information. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened? Sir, are you having any trouble breathing?" She wasn't just a commander, she was a healer, and her compassion was as vital a tool as any piece of equipment in her truck. Her most critical focus, however, was the truck driver who had been pulled from the wreckage of the blue SUV. He was a big man, in his late 40s, with the powerful build of a career laborer. His name, according to a wallet a firefighter had retrieved, was Robert Miller. Both of his legs were mangled, and he was losing blood at an alarming rate. Two of her best paramedics, a young man named Dave and a woman named Sarah, were working on him with a desperate, focused intensity. "He's hypotensive, Imani," Sarah called out as Imani knelt beside them. "Pulse is thready. We've got 2 large-bore IVs running wide open, but we can't stop the bleeding with pressure alone. We need to get him off this bridge." Imani's gloved fingers went to the man's neck, feeling the weak, rapid flutter of his carotid artery. His skin was pale and clammy, his breathing shallow. He was in hemorrhagic shock, circling the drain. Every second he spent on this hot asphalt was a second his cells were being starved of oxygen. "We're not going to get a helicopter on this bridge with the smoke," she said, her mind racing. "The closest trauma center is Memorial, 10 minutes from the base of this bridge if traffic is clear. He doesn't have 10 minutes unless we can slow this bleeding." She made a decision. "Get me the traction splints and the junctional tourniquets from my truck. Now!" It was an aggressive, high-risk intervention, but it was his only chance. While Dave ran to get the equipment, Imani and Sarah worked to expose the man's injuries fully, cutting away his torn and blood-soaked jeans. The damage was severe. This was the delicate dance she had perfected over nearly 3 decades. It was a choreography of controlled violence and gentle care, of shouted commands and whispered reassurances. The scene around her was a whirlwind of activity. Firefighters dousing the last of the flames, paramedics moving with purpose, the constant crackle of radios. But in the small bubble of space around the critically injured truck driver, there was only a singular, desperate focus. This was Imani Washington in her element. She wasn't just doing a job, she was answering a calling. Her authority wasn't derived from a badge or a title, but from a deep, almost instinctual understanding of what needed to be done. The firefighters from Engine 14 deferred to her medical judgment. The paramedics from 6 different stations followed her orders without question. In this world of flashing lights and sirens, competence was the only currency that mattered, and Imani was wealthy. But as she worked, applying a tourniquet high on the man's thigh to stanch the arterial bleed, a new figure appeared at the edge of her vision. He wore the crisp blue uniform of the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. He was young, late 20s, maybe early 30s, with a military-style haircut and the kind of rigid posture that spoke of an overabundance of self-regard. He surveyed the scene not with the practiced eye of a partner in emergency services, but with the critical gaze of a man looking for something to correct. He saw firefighters, paramedics, and a single EMS supervisor in an orange vest, a black woman, calmly directing them all. And in his mind, something registered not as order, but as a challenge. He saw a scene he believed he needed to control. Officer Kevin Price had been a cop for 6 years, 4 of them with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office after a short, unremarkable stint in a smaller town up in Georgia. He saw himself as a modern warrior, a sheepdog protecting the flock from the wolves. It was a narrative he cultivated, one that was reinforced by the echo chamber of online forums and the aggressive, control-oriented training that had shaped his worldview. He believed in order, his order, and saw any deviation from it as a sign of weakness or defiance. As he strode onto the bridge, the scene struck him as fundamentally disorganized. It wasn't the neat, cordoned-off perimeter he was used to from TV shows. It was messy, dynamic, and loud. He saw dozens of firefighters and paramedics moving with a purpose he didn't understand, their actions dictated by a logic, medical urgency, that was alien to his own. His instinct, honed by years of prioritizing scene security above all else, was to take command, to create clean lines and establish a clear hierarchy with himself at the top. His eyes scanned the chaos and landed on Imani. She was kneeling on the ground, surrounded by other paramedics, her back to him. Her orange vest designated her as some kind of supervisor, but to Price, her posture, focused, intense, and oblivious to his arrival, felt like a slight. He was the law. When he arrived, people were supposed to stop, look up, and acknowledge his presence. He was the fulcrum around which the official response was meant to pivot. He walked over, his boots crunching on the loose gravel and debris. He stood over the small group, casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. "Who's in charge here?" he asked, his voice sharp, designed to cut through the noise and command attention. One of the younger paramedics, Dave, glanced up, startled. EMS Supervisor Washington is medical command, he said, nodding toward Imani before immediately turning his attention back to the patient. Price's gaze narrowed on Imani's back. She hadn't even flinched. She was still focused on the patient, calling out instructions to the paramedic beside her. Sarah, I need you to start a second large-bore IV in his other arm. We need to get ahead of this fluid loss. To Imani, the arrival of a police officer was a routine and expected part of the operation. Her assumption was that he was there to do his job, manage traffic, secure the perimeter, investigate the cause of the crash, while she did hers. They were two parts of the same machine. She didn't look up because the man bleeding to death at her feet required every ounce of her attention. His heart was beating over 130 times a minute, a frantic, failing drum. Acknowledging the officer would have required her to divert focus, a luxury her patient did not have. To Officer Price, however, her lack of response was a breathtaking act of insubordination. He was used to being the unquestioned authority figure. He saw her focus not as professional dedication, but as a deliberate and personal insult. His internal monologue began to script a narrative of defiance. She's ignoring me. She thinks she can run this whole scene without the police. I need to establish control before this gets any more out of hand. He took another step closer, his voice louder this time, laced with an impatience that was jarringly out of place amidst the life-saving efforts. Ma'am, I'm speaking to you. I'm Officer Price, JSO. I need to know who is in charge of this scene. This time, Imani heard the edge in his voice. Without taking her eyes off the patient's leg where she was adjusting a tourniquet, she replied, her tone even and professional. I am EMS Supervisor Imani Washington. I am the Medical Incident Commander. Fire Captain Hayes is handling fire suppression. What do you need, officer? Her response, meant to be efficient and informative, only stoked his irritation. Medical Incident Commander? In his world, there was one incident commander, and it was the senior law enforcement officer on scene. Him. He failed to grasp or chose to ignore the principles of the unified command system used in all major incidents, where fire, police, and EMS leaders work as a triumvirate, each commanding their own sphere of expertise. This is a potential crime scene, Price announced, his voice taking on an officious tone. I need this entire area cleared. I need you and your people to back up so I can begin my investigation. He gestured vaguely at the space around the critically injured man, the space currently occupied by 3 paramedics, thousands of dollars of life-saving equipment, and the patient himself. Dave and Sarah froze, looking from the officer to Imani, their faces a mask of confusion. They were in the middle of a desperate fight to save a man's life. The officer's demand was so completely divorced from the reality of the situation that it didn't seem real. Imani finally paused, looking up at him for the first time. She saw a young man with a squared jaw and mirrored sunglasses that hid his eyes, creating an impassive, intimidating mask. His hand was resting on his holstered service weapon, a subtle but unmistakable posture of dominance. She recognized the type immediately. She'd encountered them before, though never this brazenly. He was an officer whose authority was a fragile thing, requiring constant validation. Officer, she said, her voice dropping, becoming preternaturally calm. She had to de-escalate this. Her patient's life depended on it. This is not an investigation scene right now. This is a rescue scene. We have a critical patient who will die if we move him without stabilizing him first. We cannot back up. We are not going anywhere. Imani's statement, delivered with the calm certainty of a seasoned professional, was meant to be educational. It was a simple statement of fact, a clarification of priorities based on the immediate and overwhelming threat to human life. She assumed, as she always had, that the shared goal of public service would ultimately prevail. She assumed that once the reality of the medical situation was made clear, the officer would understand and adjust his approach. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Officer Price did not hear a statement of medical necessity. He heard a refusal. He heard the word no from a woman he had already decided was defying him. In his rigidly hierarchical world, a lawful order was absolute, and he was the one who decided what was lawful. Her calm denial was, to him, more infuriating than a shouted curse. It was a challenge to the very foundation of his authority. "Ma'am, you seem to be confused," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "I am the law enforcement officer on this scene. My responsibility is to secure it. That means I determine who comes and goes. I am giving you a direct, lawful order to clear this area. Now." The chasm between their two realities was now miles wide. Imani was operating in a world governed by physiology and the unforgiving calculus of trauma. A severed femoral artery doesn't wait for an investigation. A heart starved of blood doesn't pause for procedure. Officer Price was operating in a world of statutes and control, where the abstract concept of securing a scene had become more important than the tangible reality of the dying man at his feet. "With all due respect, officer, your order is not lawful," Imani stated, her voice still even but now edged with a cold, hard clarity. She was no longer just a paramedic. She was a patient advocate, a human shield against a threat. Florida Statute 843.02, obstructing an officer has a clear exemption for licensed medical personnel providing life-saving care in an emergency. Furthermore, Florida Statute 401.41 explicitly makes it a crime to interfere with or obstruct emergency medical services personnel. You are the one in danger of breaking the law here, not me. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply quoted the law. It was a strategic error. To a man like Price, being told what the law was by a civilian, and a black woman at that, was the ultimate humiliation. His face, which had been tight with irritation, now flushed a deep, mottled red. The mirrored sunglasses couldn't hide the fury radiating from him. "I don't need a paramedic to lecture me on the law," he snarled, taking another menacing step forward until he was towering directly over her. "I am the authority on this scene. My order stands. Move! Now! This is your final warning." The other paramedics, Dave and Sarah, were practically holding their breath. The organized, life-saving ballet had ground to a halt. Their hands hovered over the patient, but their attention was fixed on the insane standoff unfolding above him. The patient, Robert Miller, let out a low groan, his body tensing in pain. The cardiac monitor, which had been beeping a steady, rapid rhythm, suddenly changed its tone, letting out a series of sharper, more urgent alarms. "He's throwing PVCs," Sarah said, her voice tight with fear. "His heart is getting irritable. We need to go. We need to get him off this bridge." That was it. The debate was over. Imani made a decision. She would not be intimidated. She would not let this officer's ego cost her patient his life. She turned her full attention back to the man on the ground, effectively dismissing Officer Price as if he were a fly buzzing in her ear. "Forget him," she commanded, her voice a low, urgent growl. "He doesn't matter. The patient is all that matters. Dave, get the stretcher positioned right behind me. Sarah, get ready to push the rest of the saline. We're moving him on my count. 1, 2. It was a declaration of defiance, a choice to prioritize her oath over the officer's demand. It was the right choice, the only choice, but it was a choice that would come at an unimaginable cost. As she and the other paramedics tensed their muscles to lift the patient, Officer Price moved. He didn't grab her. He didn't shove her. He did something far more insidious. He stepped directly into the space where the stretcher needed to go, planting his feet wide. His body was now a physical barrier between the medical team and their path to the ambulance, a human wall built of ego and rage. "I gave you an order," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. He unclipped his radio from his shoulder. "Dispatch, show me on scene with an uncooperative female. I need a secondary unit. I may have one in custody shortly." The threat was now explicit. He was invoking the power of the state, not to resolve the emergency, but to win the argument. The life of the man on the ground had become a secondary concern, a pawn in a petty and dangerous game of wills. Imani looked from the officer blocking her path to the deteriorating rhythm on the monitor, to the pale, sweat-soaked face of her patient. The time for de-escalation was over. The time for negotiation was past. A line had been crossed, and the world had suddenly, irrevocably gone mad. "You are obstructing emergency medical care," Imani said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but each word was imbued with the weight of her 3 decades of service. Her usual calm had been burned away, replaced by a cold, concentrated fury. She looked up at Price, her dark eyes meeting his mirrored sunglasses, and for the first time she let him see the steel beneath the surface. "You are actively harming my patient. I am ordering you, as the ranking medical officer on this scene, to step aside. Now move." It was a gamble, an attempt to reframe the encounter, to use the language of command that he might understand. But for Officer Price, it was the final, unforgivable transgression. In his mind, she hadn't just refused an order, she had tried to give him one. The carefully constructed edifice of his authority crumbled, and all that was left was raw, unreasoning rage. "That's it," he snapped. "You're done. You're under arrest." The words were so absurd, so completely untethered from the reality of the situation, that for a fraction of a second no one moved. It was like a line from a badly written movie. Dave and Sarah stared, their mouths agape. Even the firefighters who had been working nearby paused, turning to look at the scene with expressions of pure disbelief. Arrested? For what? For doing her job? Imani didn't have time to process the absurdity. She was done talking. She was done reasoning with a man who was clearly unreasonable. A life was on the line. "Dave, Sarah, ignore him. We are leaving now," she commanded, shifting her weight to lift the patient, intending to move around the officer. But as she moved, Price acted. He lunged forward, not grabbing her arm but her shoulder, and violently yanked her backward. The move was sudden and shocking. Imani, who was crouched and off balance, stumbled, falling back onto the hard asphalt. Her medical kit, which had been open beside her, tipped over, its meticulously organized contents spilling across the dirty ground. Syringes, rolls of gauze, medication vials, the tools of her trade, scattered like children's toys. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting an officer without violence," Price shouted, his voice booming with a sense of righteous triumph. He was no longer a police officer managing a scene, he was a predator who had finally cornered his prey. He pulled her to her feet with surprising force, spinning her around and wrenching her arms behind her back with a practiced, painful efficiency. The cold, unforgiving steel of handcuffs closed around her wrists. The sharp click, click, click as the ratchet tightened was the loudest sound Imani had ever heard. It was a sound of absolute insanity, the sound of a world turned completely upside down, where a healer saving a life was treated like a common felon. The bite of the metal into her skin was a sharp, grounding pain in the middle of the surreal chaos. "My patient!" The cry was ripped from her, her professional composure finally shattering. Her voice was raw with desperation and disbelief as she twisted her head to look back at the scene she'd been torn from. "Sarah, don't stop working on him! You have to get him to the hospital!" Her plea snapped Sarah and Dave out of their shocked paralysis. Dave, his face a mask of pale fury, immediately dropped back to the patient's side, checking the monitors, adjusting the oxygen. Sarah, her hands shaking with adrenaline, fumbled to gather some of the spilled supplies. They were alone now, their leader, their anchor, now a prisoner. The scene erupted. The firefighters who had been hesitant witnesses now became an angry chorus. The fire captain, Hayes, a man whose face was already blackened with soot, strode forward, his expression thunderous. "Price, what in the hell do you think you're doing? Let her go! We have a critical trauma patient on the ground." "Stay back, Captain, or you'll be in cuffs next," Price roared, his authority now absolute in his own mind. He had an arrestee in custody. He was in control. He shoved Imani toward the median, away from the patient, away from her life's work. "This is a police matter now." As he forced her away, Imani's eyes remained locked on her patient, Robert Miller, the truck driver whose life had been in her hands just seconds before. She saw Dave and Sarah working desperately, their movements now less certain, their focus shattered. She saw the man's color worsening, a ghastly ashen gray. She knew with a sickening certainty that this delay, this insane, pointless, ego-driven delay, was costing him. It was costing him blood. It was costing him brain cells. It was costing him his life. Every second that ticked by while she was being manhandled across hot asphalt was a second his chances of survival plummeted. She was a paramedic, a healer, in handcuffs, watching a man die. And the person who had put her there was the one who was supposed to be a partner in the fight for life. He hadn't just arrested her, he had abandoned his most fundamental duty. In that moment, the sharp pain in her wrists and the deep ache in her soul coalesced into a single, cold, clear resolution. This would not stand. Officer Kevin Price had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He just didn't know it yet. The back of a Jacksonville Sheriff's Office patrol car in May is an oven. The vinyl seats radiate a suffocating heat that leaches the moisture from the air. For Imani, thrust unceremoniously into the back, it was a cage of black plastic and reinforced glass. The door slammed shut with a deafening thud, a sound of finality that sealed her off from the world she commanded just moments before. The handcuffs, cinched brutally tight behind her back, dug into her wrist bones with every slight movement. The air was thick with the sterile smell of cleaning solution, a scent she usually associated with the clean confines of an ambulance, but which now smelled like captivity. Through the metal grate separating the front and back seats, she watched the scene she'd been ripped from play out like a silent, horrifying movie. Officer Price stood beside his driver's side door, not getting in, but speaking into his shoulder mic. His back was to her, but his posture was rigid, defensive. He was crafting his narrative, a story of heroism and control, turning her life-saving actions into a tale of obstruction, her professional urgency into criminal non-compliance. He was building his defense before the crime had even been fully committed. Imani pressed her face against the hot window, her gaze locked on the small circle of desperation on the other side of the bridge. She saw Sarah place a breathing bag over Robert Miller's mouth and begin to manually squeeze air into his lungs, a sign that his own respiratory drive was failing. A firefighter knelt beside her, holding the IV bags high, a stoic, soot-covered statue. It was a testament to the human spirit, a small group of strangers fighting for a life in the shadow of an incomprehensible act of malice. The wail of an approaching siren grew steadily louder. It was the secondary unit Price had called for. It was help that should never have been needed, another resource diverted not to the multi-casualty incident, but to deal with a 50-year-old paramedic who had refused to let a man die. An eternity passed, measured in the frantic squeezing of the breathing bag. 4, maybe 5 minutes. In the world of trauma care, it was a lifetime. Another JSO patrol car screamed onto the shoulder, pulling up behind Price's. A second officer got out, a stout, older man with a weary look on his face. He walked over to Price, and a hurried, tense conversation began. Price gestured emphatically toward Imani in the car, then back toward the medical scene. The second officer's head whipped around and he stared at Imani, his expression a mixture of confusion and profound disbelief. He was a veteran. He could see that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with this picture. Imani's heart ached with a helplessness she had never known. She had been in dangerous situations before, tense standoffs, violent domestic disputes, drug dens gone wrong, but she had always had her skills, her training, her ability to act. Now her hands were bound. All she could do was watch, a powerless witness to the fallout of one man's fragile ego. She watched as Dave and Sarah, with the help of 2 firefighters, finally managed to load Robert Miller onto a stretcher. Their movements were clumsy without her direction, the fluid choreography of a well-practiced team, now a desperate scramble. They lifted him, his body limp, his face a deathly gray behind the oxygen mask. Was he still alive? Had that weak, thready pulse she had fought so hard to protect finally vanished? The not knowing was a physical torment, a knot of acid in her stomach. As they wheeled the stretcher toward an ambulance, the fire captain, Hayes, jogged over to the patrol car. His face was streaked with sweat and soot, his eyes burning with a righteous fury. He couldn't open the door, but he leaned close to the window, his voice a low, angry growl. "Imani, are you okay? We're taking him to Memorial. He lost his pulse right after that bastard grabbed you. Dave had to start compressions. They're working him now, but it's bad. It's really bad. The words hit Imani like a physical blow. He lost his pulse. He had gone into full cardiac arrest. The catastrophic event she had been fighting to prevent, the very disaster that Price's intervention had directly precipitated, had happened. The delay was no longer a theoretical risk. It was measured in the death of heart cells, the starvation of a brain, the potential destruction of a life and a family. "Call the battalion chief, Mike," she instructed, her voice steady despite the tremor that ran through her body. "Call our union president. Document everything. The time Price arrived, the time of the arrest, every single second. Make sure the firefighters' reports reflect exactly what happened." "Already did," Hayes said, his jaw tight. "The whole world is about to come down on this guy's head. We've got a dozen witnesses." The ambulance carrying Robert Miller finally pulled away, its siren cutting a desperate path through the gridlocked traffic. Imani watched it go until it was just a speck in the distance, a tiny vessel carrying away the patient she had been forced to abandon. A profound sense of failure washed over her, a bitter metallic taste in her mouth. She knew logically that the failure was not her own, but in the heart of every true medic, a patient lost feels like a personal defeat. This defeat had been inflicted upon her, and she would never forgive the man responsible. The drive to the pretrial detention facility was a journey into an alternate reality. The mundane chatter on the police radio, reports of shoplifting, noise complaints, fender benders, felt like transmissions from another planet. Officer Price sat in the driver's seat, a rigid silhouette of self-satisfaction. He hadn't spoken a word to her since slamming the door. The silence in the car was a suffocating blanket, broken only by the crackle of the radio and the faint, rhythmic creak of Imani's handcuffs as she tried to find a less painful position for her arms. "That man could die," Imani said, the words breaking the silence. She needed to say it. She needed to force him to acknowledge the consequence of his actions, to pierce the bubble of his self-justification. "Because of you. Because you needed to assert your authority while his heart was failing. I hope your ego is worth a man's life." Price's knuckles whitened on the steering wheel. "You should have followed a lawful order," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "This is on you. You resisted." Imani leaned her head back against the hard plastic partition and closed her eyes. It was useless. Arguing with him was like shouting at a brick wall. He was insulated by his badge, by his own unshakable certainty, by a system that had clearly taught him that his authority was absolute. He had already convicted her in his mind to justify his own catastrophic misjudgment. The detention facility was a place Imani knew only from the other side of the door, a monolithic concrete structure downtown that hummed with a low-grade misery. She had brought patients here many times, intoxicated individuals, people suffering mental health crises who needed to be medically cleared before being booked. She had always been treated with respect, a fellow professional in a clean uniform. Now, she was being led through the sally port in handcuffs, the heavy steel doors clanging shut behind her, the sound echoing the finality of her situation. Officer Price gripped her upper arm, his fingers digging into her bicep as he steered her through the corridors as if she were a common criminal. The air inside was cold, recycled, and smelled faintly of industrial disinfectant and despair. Officers at their desks looked up as they passed, their conversations faltering. Their eyes registered her dark blue JFRD uniform first, then the handcuffs, and a wave of confusion and morbid curiosity rippled through the room. A paramedic in cuffs was not a common sight. Price pushed her toward the booking desk, a high counter presided over by a world-weary-looking sergeant, a stout man in his 50s with a graying mustache and a nameplate that read, Sergeant Miller, a bitter irony that was not lost on Imani. "Got one for booking," Price announced, his voice unnecessarily loud, playing to the audience. "Obstruction and resisting." Sergeant Miller looked up from his paperwork, his gaze falling on Imani, then on Price. He raised a skeptical eyebrow, his eyes lingering on the JFRD patch on her sleeve. "Resisting what? A bad diagnosis? he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He knew her. You're Washington, right? From Station 4? You brought in that guy who fell off the roof last month. What in God's name is going on, Price? She refused to follow a lawful order at the scene of the bridge collapse, Price said, puffing out his chest slightly. Interfered with my investigation. What investigation? Sergeant Miller pressed, his tone sharp. He wasn't buying it. I've been listening to the radio chatter for the last hour. That scene was a 5-alarm mess. A man was coding on the asphalt. What exactly did she obstruct? His path to the afterlife? The sarcasm was thick, and a few officers within earshot chuckled into their computer screens. Price's face flushed. She refused to provide identification and became belligerent. Officer, I was treating a critical patient, Imani interjected, her voice calm and measured, a stark contrast to Price's bluster. I informed Officer Price that I would provide my credentials as soon as the patient was stabilized for transport. His life was the priority. Sergeant Miller's eyes narrowed, looking from Imani's resolute face to Price's defensive one. The veteran sergeant had been on the job for 30 years. He could smell a bad arrest from a mile away, and this one reeked. You pulled a medic off a coding patient to ask for her driver's license? He asked Price, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous level. Is that what you're telling me? I was securing the scene, Price insisted, but his voice had lost some of its bravado under the weight of the older officer's disbelief. Sergeant Miller just shook his head slowly, a look of profound disappointment on his face. He turned to the booking officer. Process her, and be quick about it. Get her union rep on the phone. He shot a final withering glare at Price. My office. Now. The booking process was a systematic stripping away of dignity. Imani's fingerprints were taken, the black ink smearing on her skin. A mugshot was taken, the flash of the camera capturing her exhausted but defiant expression. She was instructed to remove her shoelaces, her belt, and her personal belongings. Her wallet, which contained her driver's license and her paramedic certifications, her phone, her watch, her wedding ring. Each item, a small piece of her identity, was placed in a clear plastic bag and catalogued with bureaucratic indifference. The irony was suffocating. The very identification Price had deemed more important than a man's life was now being handled as evidence of her supposed crime. After the paperwork was complete, she was led to a small, cold holding cell. The heavy metal door slid shut, and the lock engaged with a deafening clang. Imani was alone. The cell contained nothing but a concrete bench and a steel toilet. She sat down, the cold of the bench seeping through her uniform. For the first time since the call came in, the adrenaline began to recede, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a profound sense of violation. She had dedicated her life to helping people, to being the calm in the storm. And for doing her job, for doing what was right, she had been locked in a cage. She put her head in her hands, not in despair, but in a quiet, simmering rage. This was more than just a bad cop having a bad day. This was a systemic failure, and she was going to burn it to the ground. Time in the holding cell was a thick, syrupy thing that refused to move. Imani measured its passage by the changing shifts of light through the small, high window and the distant, muffled sounds of the station. She heard phones ringing, officers laughing, the routine hum of a world that had not stopped for her injustice. Each minute that passed felt like an accusation, a fresh layer of insult on the injury. She replayed the encounter with Price in her mind, dissecting every word, every action. Could she have handled it differently? Should she have been more compliant, shown him her ID, and hoped for the best? The answer every time was a resolute no. Compliance would have been a betrayal of her patient. It would have meant conceding that a police officer's demand for paperwork superseded a paramedic's duty to save a life. It was a principle she would not, could not, surrender. But the cost of that principle was this: a cold concrete bench and the gnawing uncertainty about Robert Miller's fate. She'd been in the cell for what felt like hours, but was probably closer to 90 minutes when she heard footsteps approaching. Not the heavy, purposeful tread of a uniformed officer, but a quicker, more energetic cadence. A man in a tailored Navy suit stopped in front of her cell door. He was in his late 40s with a sharp, intelligent face, a neatly trimmed graying beard, and eyes that seemed to assess everything in a single, sweeping glance. He carried a leather briefcase that looked both expensive and well-used. "Imani Washington?" he asked, his voice calm and confident. Imani stood up and walked to the bars. "Yes. My name is Mark Preston. I'm an attorney with the Paramedics Union. Your captain, Mike Hayes, called your union president, and the president called me. I came as fast as I could." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "Let's get you out of here." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over Imani. She wasn't alone anymore. The system she had dedicated her life to, the brotherhood and sisterhood of first responders, was now fighting for her. "Thank you for coming." "Don't thank me yet," Preston said, already pulling a legal pad and a pen from his briefcase. "I've already had a spirited conversation with Sergeant Miller. He's deeply unhappy with his officer's conduct, to put it mildly, but the arrest report has been filed. Officer Price is doubling down, claiming you were belligerent and created a safety issue. We need to build our case, starting right now. I want you to tell me everything that happened, from the moment you got the call. Don't leave out a single detail, no matter how small." Imani began her story. With the precision of a trained medical professional reporting a patient's history, she recounted the entire event. The dispatch call, the patient's condition, her initial assessment, the desperate effort to control the bleeding. Then she described Officer Price's arrival, his tone, his posture, his immediate demands. She detailed her repeated attempts to explain the medical urgency, his refusal to listen, his escalation, the physical assault, and the arrest. Preston listened intently, his pen flying across the page, his expression growing grimmer with every word. He would occasionally interrupt with a sharp, clarifying question. Did he ever state what crime he was investigating, other than the crash itself? No, just that it was a potential crime scene and he needed to secure it. Did he ask about the patient's condition? Did he show any concern at all for the man's well-being? None. Zero. His only concern was establishing his authority and seeing my ID. And you told him where your ID was? I told him it was in my truck, and that he was welcome to verify my credentials with my crew or through dispatch, but that I would not stop active treatment of a critical patient to get it for him. Preston nodded, a grim satisfaction on his face. That's perfect. You established a clear willingness to comply once the exigent medical circumstance was resolved. His refusal to accept that is key. He looked up from his notes. Imani, what he did wasn't just a bad judgment call, it was illegal. State law is crystal clear on the issue of interfering with emergency medical personnel. The arrest was unlawful from the moment he laid hands on you. He closed his notepad. They'll release you within the hour. The charges of obstruction and resisting are baseless. They won't even make it to a prosecutor's desk. This is a classic case of what we lawyers call contempt of cop, and it's not a real crime. Price arrested you because you challenged his authority, not because you broke the law. What about my patient? Imani asked, the question that had been tormenting her for hours. Do you know anything? Preston's expression softened. Captain Hayes gave me an update. He was transported to Memorial. He went into full cardiac arrest at the scene, as you feared. They were performing CPR on him in the ambulance. They managed to get a pulse back just as they arrived at the ER, but the trauma surgeon called his condition extremely critical. The next few hours will tell the tale. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. The delay in transport. It's going to be a major factor in this case. If the worst happens, this goes from being an unlawful arrest to a potential wrongful death suit. The city knows that. They're already in damage control mode. True to Preston's word, the cell door slid open 40 minutes later. Sergeant Miller was standing there, his expression stern. You're being released on your own recognizance, Washington. The charges are being reviewed, but I don't expect them to stick. He handed Imani the plastic bag with her belongings. For what it's worth, he said, his voice low. "I'm sorry this happened. He was out of line." Imani just nodded, taking her property. The apology was a small concession, but it was something. As she walked out of the station with Mark Preston at her side, blinking in the harsh afternoon sun, she felt like she was surfacing after being held underwater. She was free, but she wasn't whole. A part of her was still back on that bridge, fighting for a life that had been needlessly endangered. And another part of her was now steeling itself for the bigger fight to come. This wasn't over. It had just begun. In the world of high-stakes litigation, the first move from a defendant like a city is often a test of resolve, a jab to see if the opponent will flinch. 2 weeks after Imani's arrest, after the baseless charges had been formally dropped, and after Mark Preston had filed the initial notice of intent to sue, the call he had been expecting came. It was from the city attorney's office. "They want to talk settlement," he told Imani over the phone. They were in his sleek, modern office in downtown Jacksonville, a world away from the grit of the holding cell. "They're trying to gauge how serious we are, see if they can make this go away quietly." "What are they offering?" Imani asked, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. She was on paid administrative leave, a frustrating limbo that felt more like a punishment than a support measure. Preston let out a short, humorless laugh. "You should sit down for this. They're offering to pay your legal fees and give you $50,000 for your trouble. They called it a nuisance value settlement." Imani was silent for a moment, processing the sheer, unmitigated audacity of the offer. $50,000. It wasn't a settlement, it was an insult. It was the monetary equivalent of a pat on the head and a run along now. It was a pittance meant to make a very big problem disappear before it got too expensive or, more importantly, too embarrassing. It was an offer made by people who saw this not as a gross violation of civil rights and a near-fatal dereliction of duty, but as a public relations inconvenience to be managed and buried. It was the price they put on her humiliation, on her integrity, on the minutes stolen from a dying man. "Tell them no," Imani said, her voice laced with ice. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of a final judgment. "Tell them I'll see them in court." "That's what I thought you'd say," Preston replied, a note of pride in his voice. "I already told them their offer was offensive and that our next conversation would be during depositions. This was their gambit. They were hoping you were just looking for a quick payday, that the pressure and the desire to put this behind you would make you fold. They misjudged you." They had. The city's lawyers and risk managers had made a critical, fundamental error. They had mistaken Imani's quiet professionalism for weakness. They didn't understand that her fight was no longer just about her own vindication. It had become about Robert Miller. Miller, the truck driver, had survived the surgery, but just barely. He had spent 8 days in a medically induced coma. When he finally woke up, the doctors delivered the devastating news. The prolonged lack of oxygen to his lower body, caused by the cardiac arrest and the significant delay in getting him to the operating room, had resulted in irreversible nerve and muscle damage. His right leg had to be amputated below the knee. His left leg was saved, but it would require years of painful rehabilitation, and he would likely never walk without assistance again. He was 48 years old. His life as a man who worked with his hands and his strength was over. He had been permanently, catastrophically disabled because of a 7-minute delay on the side of a highway. His family had already retained their own lawyer and were preparing a separate multi-million-dollar lawsuit against the city. The two cases, while legally distinct, were inextricably linked. Every victory for Imani would be a victory for Robert. The city's refusal to take her lawsuit seriously had the opposite of its intended effect. Instead of silencing her, it galvanized her. And when news of the insultingly low settlement offer leaked to the press, a strategic and anonymous leak from Preston's office, the story exploded with renewed fury. Editorials were written in the Florida Times-Union condemning the city's callousness. National news outlets picked up the story, framing it as a textbook example of police overreach and municipal arrogance. A GoFundMe page started by Imani's fire station to help with any uncovered expenses was flooded with donations from strangers across the country. Paramedics from as far away as San Diego and Boston sent messages of solidarity. She had become an unwilling symbol for every first responder who had ever been bullied, questioned, or impeded by a law enforcement officer on a power trip. The pressure on the city mounted. The sheriff held a tense press conference where he was hammered with questions about Officer Price's disciplinary record. It was revealed that Price, in his short 6-year career, had accumulated over a dozen citizen complaints for excessive force and abuse of authority, none of which had resulted in any significant disciplinary action beyond a token verbal counseling. He was a lawsuit waiting to happen, a problem the department had ignored and shuffled around until it blew up in their faces on a national stage. For Imani, life had become surreal. She was on paid leave from the job she loved, spending her days in meetings with lawyers instead of responding to 911 calls. She tried to keep a low profile, but her face was everywhere. She'd be recognized at the grocery store, with strangers stopping her to shake her hand and thank her for standing up. The attention was uncomfortable, but it strengthened her resolve. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore, she was fighting for all of them. Preston used the intense media scrutiny to his advantage, pressing forward aggressively with the lawsuit. "We're moving into the discovery phase," he told her during one of their strategy sessions. "This is where they have to turn over everything. Price's complete personnel file, all internal emails and memos related to the incident, and most importantly, the one piece of evidence that will decide this case, the unedited footage from Officer Price's body camera." He leaned forward, his expression intense. Price thinks his report, his narrative, will protect him. The city thinks their lawyers can spin this, but the camera doesn't spin, it just shows. And what it's going to show a jury is a hero trying to save a life, and a bully with a badge who was willing to let a man lose his leg and nearly his life to prove a point. They wanted to silence this story with a check. Instead, they've guaranteed that it will be told, under oath, in a federal courtroom. The discovery process in a federal lawsuit is a slow, methodical grinding of legal gears, a battle fought not in a courtroom, but through a relentless exchange of documents and data. For months, Mark Preston's office was inundated with thousands of pages from the city, training manuals, internal affairs reports, policy guidelines, and Officer Price's complete, unredacted personnel file, which confirmed the pattern of complaints. But all of it was secondary to the single digital file they had been waiting for. It arrived on a password-protected hard drive delivered by a court courier. The body camera footage. Preston had it set up in a conference room on a large monitor. Imani sat beside him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her captain, Mike Hayes, was there too, for support and to corroborate the sequence of events from his perspective. "Are you ready for this?" Preston asked her gently. Imani took a deep breath and nodded. "Play it." The video began with a jarring, unsteady view of the ground as Officer Price got out of his patrol car. The audio was crystal clear. The roar of the distant fire, the crackle of his radio, the crunch of his boots on asphalt. Then he began walking toward the scene. The camera's perspective was his own, an unnerving first-person view of the confrontation to come. He approached the circle of firefighters and paramedics. His voice, captured with perfect fidelity by the microphone on his uniform, was already sharp. "Who's in charge here?" Then the camera centered on her. A version of Imani kneeling on the ground, her back to the camera, completely engrossed in treating Robert Miller. The footage was visceral, immediate. It captured the gray, sweaty pallor of Miller's skin, the shallow, desperate gasps for air he was taking. It was obvious to anyone, medically trained or not, that he was in extreme distress. The audio was even more damning than Imani remembered. "Ma'am, I'm speaking to you," Price's voice commanded, cold and devoid of any empathy. Her own voice replied, calm and focused, never looking up. "I am EMS Supervisor Imani Washington. I am the Medical Incident Commander." The footage perfectly corroborated her story. Her attention was and remained on saving a life. It showed her clear, concise explanations of the medical emergency. It recorded her quoting the state statutes that protected her right to treat her patient. It captured her utter lack of belligerence, her tone remaining professional and steady even as his grew more agitated and aggressive. Watching it now, from his perspective, was chilling. The camera showed no interest in the patient. It remained fixed on her, the perceived source of defiance. Then came the escalation. The camera lurched as Price stepped forward to block the path of the stretcher. His voice, captured inches from his mouth, was a low growl. "You are obstructing my investigation." Her reply was just as clear. "You are obstructing emergency medical care." The most crucial moment was the arrest itself. The video showed Price lunging forward. It showed him grabbing her shoulder. The camera swung wildly, capturing a chaotic jumble of Imani's back, the sky, and the medical kits spilling across the ground. Then the view steadied as Price spun her around and forced her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs were picked up with perfect, sickening clarity by the microphone. The video continued for another 20 minutes. It recorded the angry shouts of Captain Hayes and the other firefighters. It recorded Dave and Sarah's desperate struggle to take over care for the patient. It recorded the moment Dave shouted, "He's lost his pulse! Starting compressions!" A moment that occurred less than 90 seconds after Imani was pulled away. And it recorded the long, silent walk back to the patrol car, where Imani was placed in the back like a piece of cargo. When the video ended, the conference room was silent. Captain Hayes was shaking his head, his face pale. Imani felt strangely numb, vindicated but also sickened. It was all there. Every lie in Price's report, every self-serving statement the city had made was obliterated by this single, unblinking recording of the truth. Mark Preston sat back in his chair, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He looked at Imani. "In 25 years of practicing law," he said, his voice quiet with awe, "I have never seen a more powerful, more damning piece of evidence. That camera didn't just record an unlawful arrest, it recorded a man's soul. It recorded his arrogance, his insecurity, and his utter disregard for human life." He stood up and began to pace the room, energized, a predator who had just been handed the keys to the kingdom. "This changes everything. Their entire strategy was to paint you as the aggressor, as uncooperative and emotional. This video proves you were the only person in that interaction who remained calm, professional, and focused on the job at hand. Price wasn't a cop maintaining order. He was a bully who couldn't handle a woman, a black woman, telling him she had more important things to do than stroke his ego." Preston stopped pacing and looked at the blank screen. "The city's lawyers will see this footage and they will know their case is unwinnable. They'll come back to the table with a real settlement offer, a 7-figure offer." He turned to Imani, his eyes glinting. "But we're not going to take it." "We're not?" Imani asked, surprised. "No," Preston said, his voice firm. "We're going to show this video to a jury. We're going to let 12 ordinary citizens from this community see what Officer Kevin Price did on that bridge. We're going to depose him, make him watch it, and make him explain every single second of it under oath. This case is no longer about getting you a settlement, Imani. It's about getting you justice. The kind of justice that changes laws and ends careers." A deposition is not a trial. There is no judge, no jury. It takes place in the sterile, soundproofed confines of a law firm's conference room. But in many ways, it is more grueling. It is a slow, methodical dissection of a witness's story, a verbal autopsy designed to lock them into a version of events they cannot later change, and to expose every weakness, every contradiction, every lie. Officer Kevin Price walked into the deposition room flanked by 2 attorneys from the city. He wore a crisp uniform, his posture ramrod straight. He carried himself with the same air of unshakable confidence he'd had on the bridge. He was there to defend his actions, to project the image of a decisive officer who had been forced to take control of a chaotic scene from an uncooperative, belligerent paramedic. He believed his badge and his version of the story, memorialized in his official report, would protect him. He was wrong. For the first hour, the city's lead attorney led Price through his own testimony, allowing him to construct his narrative. He described arriving at a disorderly scene, his attempts to secure the area for the safety of all personnel, and Paramedic Washington's immediate and hostile refusal to comply with lawful orders. He painted a picture of himself as the calm center of a storm, a professional doing his job under difficult circumstances. Then it was Mark Preston's turn. Preston began calmly, his questions simple and direct. "Officer Price, you've been with the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office for 4 years, is that correct?" "Yes, sir. And in that time, have you received training on the Unified Command System for multi-agency emergency scenes?" "Yes, sir. We receive extensive training. And that training instructs you that at a medical emergency, the ranking medical officer is in charge of all patient care, correct?" Price shifted in his seat. "My priority is to secure the scene." "That wasn't my question, officer," Preston said, his voice still mild. "Does your training instruct you that a paramedic's active treatment of a critical patient takes precedence over administrative requests, like asking for identification?" The city's attorney objected, but Preston just smiled. "Let me rephrase. At any point did you believe the patient, Mr. Miller, was not in serious medical distress?" "I am not a medical professional," Price said stiffly. "I could not make that assessment." "Exactly," Preston pounced, his voice sharpening slightly. "You are not a medical professional. Yet you felt qualified to order the actual senior medical professional on scene to stop providing care. Is that correct?" "I ordered her to step back so I could secure the scene." Preston nodded slowly, then turned to his paralegal. "Please play the first video exhibit. Body camera footage of Officer Price, timestamp 13:51:14. The large monitor at the end of the conference table flickered to life. The deposition room was filled with the sounds of the bridge. Preston had Price watch the first 2 minutes, showing his arrival and his initial aggressive demands. "Officer," Preston said, pausing the video just after Price had yelled, "This is your final warning." At this point, you had been on scene for less than 45 seconds. You had not spoken to the fire captain. You had not assessed any potential criminal threats. Yet you decided the most important action was to stop the paramedic from treating her patient. Why? "I was establishing control of the scene," Price repeated, his jaw tight. It was the phrase he clung to, his mantra. "Control over what, exactly?" Preston asked, his voice laced with incredulity. "A 50-year-old woman on her knees trying to save a man's life." Preston let the question hang in the air before playing the next segment, the one where Imani calmly explained the patient's condition and quoted the state statutes. He paused it again. "Officer, on this video we can hear Paramedic Washington, a 28-year veteran with an exemplary record, informing you of the specific laws that govern this situation. She was correct, wasn't she? State law does protect her right to treat that patient." "My orders are lawful," Miller said, his face turning pale. He was beginning to realize the camera had captured more than he remembered. "Is it a lawful order to command someone to break the law, officer? Is it standard procedure to arrest a paramedic for prioritizing her dying patient over your request for her driver's license?" Preston's voice was rising now, losing its gentle tone and taking on a hard, prosecutorial edge. For the next 4 hours, Preston dismantled Price's story piece by piece, using the officer's own camera footage as the wrecking ball. He forced Price to watch himself yank Imani away from the patient. "Please describe for the record what is happening in this video, officer." Price stared at the screen, his face ashen. "I am effecting an arrest." "You are physically assaulting a licensed paramedic and preventing her from rendering aid," Preston corrected him. "Did you see the medical kit spill onto the ground? Did you hear your fellow first responders shouting at you to stop? Did you see the patient unattended while you focused on handcuffing Ms. Washington?" He then played the most damning part of the audio, the moment less than 2 minutes after the arrest when the other paramedic shouted that the patient had lost his pulse. "Officer Price, do you acknowledge that less than 120 seconds after you physically removed the senior paramedic from the patient's side, that patient went into full cardiac arrest?" Price was silent, staring at his hands on the table. Answer the question, officer. That is what the video shows, he mumbled. By the end of the deposition, Kevin Price was a changed man. His arrogance had evaporated, replaced by a sullen, defensive silence. His carefully constructed narrative of a hero cop had been exposed as a self-serving fantasy. The deposition transcript would show him to be evasive, argumentative, and ultimately unable to provide a single credible justification for his actions. He had walked into the room a confident officer of the law. He walked out a man who knew his career was over. The city's attorneys knew it too. Their faces were grim. They had built their entire defense around the testimony of their officer, and Preston had just reduced that testimony to rubble. The unblinking eye of the camera, combined with Preston's relentless questioning, had left them with nothing. Their star witness had just become their biggest liability. The day after the deposition, Mark Preston's phone rang. It was the lead counsel for the city of Jacksonville. The tone was no longer dismissive or condescending. It was the sound of complete and utter defeat. The city's new settlement offer arrived not with a phone call, but in a formal letter delivered by courier. The tone had shifted from dismissive to desperate. They were no longer talking about nuisance value. They were trying to stop a freight train of bad publicity and legal liability from plowing through the city's budget. Mark Preston slid the letter across his desk to Imani. On it was a number, $2.5 million. Imani stared at the figure. It was a life-changing amount of money. It was an admission of guilt, a clear signal that the city knew it had no legal leg to stand on. It was enough to pay off her mortgage, secure her retirement, set up college funds for her grandchildren, and live without financial worry for the rest of her life. It was everything the city had said her ordeal wasn't worth, and then some. Part of her, the tired part that had been living this nightmare for months, wanted to say yes. She wanted it to be over. She wanted to stop the endless meetings, the media attention, the gnawing anxiety of the impending trial. She wanted to go back to her life, to her ambulance, to the simple, profound work of saving people. "What do you think?" she asked Preston, her voice quiet. Preston leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "From a purely financial perspective, it's a very strong offer. We could probably push them higher, but this is in the ballpark of a major victory without the risk and stress of a trial. If you take this, you walk away with financial security, and we can force them to expunge the arrest record as part of the deal. No one would blame you for taking it." He paused, his gaze steady. "But you didn't come to me for a purely financial perspective. You came to me for justice." Justice. The word hung in the air between them. Was this justice? A check and a quiet end to the affair? Officer Price would likely be fired, but the system that created him, the policies that enabled him, the culture that protected him, all of that would remain unchanged. The next Officer Price, in another city, on another bridge, could do the very same thing to another paramedic. The money would fix her problems, but it wouldn't fix the problem. She thought about Robert Miller, who had just begun the long, painful process of learning to walk with a prosthesis. She thought about his family, their lives forever altered. She thought about the dozens of messages of support she'd received from EMTs and paramedics across the country, stories of their own run-ins with police, of being bullied, threatened, and treated like subordinates instead of partners. She thought of the low-grade fear they all felt, the worry that doing their job correctly could somehow put them on the wrong side of a badge. This wasn't just her fight anymore. The media attention and the upcoming trial had turned her case into something bigger. It had become a test case, a potential landmark for the rights of all first responders. "This offer comes with a non-disclosure agreement, doesn't it?" Imani asked. Preston nodded. "Of course. A bulletproof one. They want your silence. They'll pay a premium for it. They want to make sure that body camera footage is never shown in a public court. They want to ensure that Price's deposition transcript is never released." That was the deal breaker. They wanted to buy her story, to bury the truth she had fought so hard to bring to light. They wanted to pay her to pretend this never happened. No, Imani said, the single word firm and clear. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard certainty. No deal. A slow smile spread across Mark Preston's face. It was the answer he had been hoping for. I thought you might say that. This isn't about the money, Mark, Imani continued, leaning forward, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. It was never about the money. This is about making sure that no paramedic, no EMT, no firefighter ever has to hesitate to treat a patient because they're afraid of the police officer standing over their shoulder. I want that body camera footage shown in court. I want Price to have to answer for what he did in front of a jury of his peers. And I want a verdict that sends a message, not just to the city of Jacksonville, but to every police department in this country, that you do not interfere with medical personnel who are saving a life. Period. Her stand was a declaration. She was turning down a fortune for a principle. She was choosing the uncertainty and agony of a public trial over the comfort and security of a private settlement. It was a choice that would require immense courage. But for Imani, it was the only choice she could live with. She had fought for her patient on the side of the road, and now she would fight for every patient and every paramedic in a court of law. The city thought they could buy her off. They were about to learn that her integrity and the justice she sought were not for sale at any price. With settlement talks officially dead, the machinery of the federal court system ground toward a trial date. The weeks leading up to it were a blur of intense preparation for Imani. Mark Preston and his team put her through mock cross-examinations, peppering her with the most aggressive, accusatory questions the city's lawyers could possibly devise. They wanted to prepare her for the stress of the witness stand, to ensure that her composure, which had been so powerful on the body cam footage, would hold under the withering pressure of a courtroom. The trial was not just a legal proceeding, it was a form of theater, and the first act was jury selection, or voir dire. This was where the tone of the entire trial would be set. It was a painstaking process of questioning a pool of ordinary citizens to uncover biases, both conscious and unconscious, that could influence their judgment. Imani sat at the plaintiff's table beside Mark Preston, watching as dozens of potential jurors were brought into the stately, wood-paneled courtroom. They were a cross-section of the community: teachers, retirees, mechanics, small business owners. 12 of them would be chosen to decide her fate. The city's legal team, led by a sharp, immaculately dressed man named Alan Davies, was looking for a specific type of juror. They wanted people who were instinctively pro-law enforcement, people who believed that questioning a police officer was inherently wrong. They asked questions like, do you believe it is a citizen's duty to comply with any order given by a police officer without question? And, do you have any family members who have had a negative experience with law enforcement? Mark Preston's approach was the opposite. He was searching for empathy and critical thinking. He was looking for people who could understand the concept of conflicting duties, people who trusted medical professionals, and people who were skeptical of unchecked authority. His questions were more nuanced. Imagine a situation where a firefighter tells you to evacuate a building because it's on fire, but a police officer tells you to stay put for an investigation. In that moment of conflict, whose expertise would you be more inclined to trust regarding the immediate threat to your life? One potential juror, a retired Navy Chief Petty Officer, answered without hesitation. You trust the expert in the relevant field. The firefighter knows fire. The cop knows the law. You don't ask a lawyer to put out a fire. Preston made a small, satisfied check mark on his notepad. Another potential juror, a young software developer, was questioned by the city's attorney. Do you believe police officers have a difficult and dangerous job? Of course, the young man answered. And do you believe they sometimes have to make split-second decisions to maintain control? Yes, the man said thoughtfully. But I also believe they have a responsibility not to create a crisis where one doesn't already exist. Davies thanked him and moved on, but Preston's eyes lingered on the man. He had found someone who could see the gray areas, who understood that authority came with immense responsibility. The process took 2 full days. It was a fascinating high-stakes exercise in human psychology. Imani watched as potential jurors were dismissed for a variety of reasons. One man, whose brother was a JSO officer, was struck by Preston. A woman who expressed deep distrust for all forms of government authority was struck by the city. Slowly, methodically, the pool was whittled down. By the end of the second day, they had their jury, 12 citizens and 2 alternates. It was a diverse group. The retired Navy chief had made it. So had the young software developer. There was a registered nurse, a high school science teacher, a stay-at-home mother, a plumber, and several others. Preston was pleased. It was not a jury that was inherently anti-police, but it was a jury of thoughtful, independent thinkers. They were people who respected authority but were not blinded by it. They were people who would be able to watch that body camera footage and see not an officer and a civilian, but 2 public servants with competing duties, and judge which duty was more important in that critical moment. As they left the courthouse that evening, the reality of the situation finally hit Imani with its full weight. The next morning, the trial would begin. Her life, her reputation, and a cause that had become bigger than herself would be placed in the hands of those 12 strangers. "How are you feeling?" Preston asked, sensing her anxiety. "Like I'm about to run the most important call of my life," Imani admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Preston stopped and placed a hand on her shoulder. "You've been preparing for this your whole life, Imani. Not in law books, but in the back of an ambulance, in every crisis you've ever managed. All you have to do tomorrow is the same thing you did on that bridge. Stay calm, be professional, and tell the truth. The truth is all we need." His words were a comfort, but as she drove home through the warm Jacksonville evening, Imani knew that the truth was a fragile thing. In a courtroom, it could be twisted, obscured, and attacked. Her principled stand had led her to this moment. Now all she could do was trust that the truth, and the 12 people chosen to hear it, would be enough. The trial began not with Imani, but with Robert Miller. Mark Preston knew that before the jury could understand the crime against Imani, they had to understand the stakes. They had to see the human cost of Officer Price's actions. Robert walked slowly to the witness stand, leaning heavily on a cane, his prosthetic right leg making a soft, rhythmic thump on the courtroom floor. He was thinner than he had been on the day of the incident, his face gaunt, his work-worn hands trembling slightly. The confident, commanding truck driver was gone, replaced by a man who looked a decade older than his 48 years. Getting him to the courtroom had been a battle. He was still weak, and the emotional toll of reliving the worst day of his life was immense. But he had insisted. He needed to do this for Imani. Preston approached the witness stand, his demeanor gentle and respectful. "Mr. Miller, could you please tell the jury what you remember from the afternoon of May 23rd? Robert took a sip of water, his hand shaking. "Not much, to be honest," he said, his voice raspy. "I remember the heat. It was a hot one. I was behind the tanker. It blew a tire. Everything just happened so fast. A big bang. Then darkness." He looked down at his hands. "The next thing I remember, I was waking up in a hospital bed a week later, and my wife was crying, and my leg was gone." The courtroom was silent, captivated by his simple, powerful testimony. "Do you remember a paramedic being with you after you collapsed?" Preston asked. "I don't remember seeing her," Robert said, "but I remember hearing her. It was foggy, like I was underwater, but I could hear a woman's voice. She was calm. She was telling me to hang on, that she was there, that help was coming. It was a lifeline. It was the only thing I had to hold on to." He paused, his eyes filling with tears. He looked directly at Imani, who sat at the plaintiff's table, her own eyes glistening. "That voice, I found out later who she was. That voice is the reason I'm alive today." The city's attorney, Alan Davies, rose for cross-examination, his approach cautious. He knew he had to tread lightly. Attacking a sympathetic, one-legged victim was a risky strategy. Mr. Miller, you have a separate lawsuit filed against the city of Jacksonville, don't you? Davies asked. Yes, sir. And that lawsuit seeks millions of dollars in damages, correct? It seeks to cover my medical bills, which are already over $1 million, and to provide for my family now that I can't work anymore, Robert said, his voice gaining a spark of its former strength. So you have a significant financial interest in the outcome of this trial, don't you? If the jury finds in favor of Ms. Washington, it would certainly help your case, wouldn't it? Sir, Robert said, leaning forward, his gaze fixed on the lawyer. If I won the lottery tomorrow, it wouldn't give me my leg back. It wouldn't let me go back to the job I loved for 30 years. It wouldn't let me pick up my grandkids. He then turned his head and looked at the jury. But I can tell you what might have. A few more minutes. That's what the doctors told me. A few more minutes. If the paramedic who was trying to save my life had been allowed to do her job, if she had gotten me to the hospital a few minutes sooner, maybe they could have saved my leg. Maybe my heart wouldn't have stopped. Maybe. He turned back to Davies. So you can ask me about my lawsuit, but what this is really about is time. The time that your police officer stole from me. Davies had no more questions. He had tried to paint Robert as a biased witness motivated by greed, and instead, Robert had turned it around, delivering the most powerful indictment of his client's actions he could have imagined. He had given the jury a clock. He had shown them that the conflict on that bridge wasn't about abstract legal principles. It was about minutes and seconds that separated a whole life from a broken one. The rest of the day was filled with testimony from the other witnesses. Captain Mike Hayes took the stand, his voice shaking with anger as he recounted how he had to watch his colleague and friend be arrested while their patient went into cardiac arrest. One of the firefighters testified, describing Price's aggressive behavior and Imani's calm professionalism. The ER doctor who treated Robert took the stand, explaining in precise clinical detail how the delay in transport had directly contributed to the ischemic cascade that led to the death of the tissue in Robert's leg, making amputation unavoidable. With each witness, Preston was building a wall of evidence around Officer Price, brick by brick. He was showing the jury the full context of the situation, the ripple effect of one man's bad decision. By the time court adjourned for the day, the atmosphere in the room had shifted palpably. The jurors were no longer just passive observers. They were invested. They had heard from the survivor, from the captain, from the witnesses, from the doctor. They had heard the story from every angle except two, Imani's and Officer Price's. The stage was set for the main event. The next day, the jury would finally see the video. The energy in the courtroom was electric on the fourth day of the trial. This was the day the jury would see what happened for themselves. Ben Carter began the morning by calling his final witness, Imani Washington. Imani walked to the stand with a quiet confidence. She looked professional and composed in a simple dark suit. For an hour, Carter led her through her story, her training, and the events on the bridge. Her testimony was clear, concise, and devoid of melodrama. She spoke not as a victim, but as a professional, explaining a catastrophic failure in interagency cooperation. She described the medical situation in detail, explaining to the jury what hemorrhagic shock was and why every second was critical. Then, Carter walked to the large screen set up in front of the jury box. Your Honor, the plaintiff would now like to play the body camera footage of Officer Kevin Price. The lights in the courtroom were dimmed slightly. The room was silent as the video began to play. For the next 10 minutes, the jury was transported to the side of the Fuller-Warren Bridge. They saw the scene not from a distance, but through the eyes of the man who caused the crisis. They saw Imani's focused professionalism. They saw Robert Miller's gray, dying face. They heard Price's aggressive demands and Imani's calm, firm refusals. They heard her literally pleading for her patient's life. And then they saw it. They saw Price, from his own point of view, lunge forward and grab Imani. They saw him yank her away from her patient. They saw him spin her around and force her arms behind her back. The sharp metallic clicks of the handcuffs echoed through the silent courtroom. Several jurors flinched. One woman, the registered nurse, put her hand over her mouth in shock. A man in the back row, the retired Navy chief, shook his head slowly, his lips pressed into a thin, angry line. They weren't just hearing about the arrest anymore, they were witnessing an assault. When the video ended and the lights came up, the impact was visceral. The footage had transformed the case. It was no longer a matter of he said, she said. It was a matter of objective, undeniable reality. The city's attorney, Alan Davies, knew he was in deep trouble. His cross-examination of Imani was tentative, almost apologetic. He tried to portray her as insubordinate, but the video had already refuted that. Ms. Washington, you'd agree that when a police officer gives you an order, you should follow it. I agree that I should follow a lawful order, Imani corrected him gently. An order that forces me to abandon a dying patient in violation of my medical oath and state law is not a lawful order. Davies had no effective rebuttal. Imani's testimony, backed by the video, was a fortress. After Imani stepped down, the defense had no choice but to call their only witness, Officer Kevin Price. He walked to the stand, his face a grim mask. He knew what was coming. Davies led him through his testimony, but it was a hollow exercise. Everyone in the room had already seen the truth. His claims of a chaotic scene and a belligerent paramedic sounded absurd after watching the video. Then it was Preston's turn for cross-examination. He approached the witness stand not with anger, but with a quiet, surgical precision. "Officer Price," he began, "we've all seen the footage from your body camera. We saw you arrest a paramedic while she was actively treating a man in hemorrhagic shock. I have only one question for you. Watching that video today, knowing that Mr. Miller lost his leg and nearly his life, is there anything you would have done differently?" It was a lifeline, a chance for Price to show some remorse, some humanity. He could have said, "In hindsight, I should have waited." He could have said, "I misjudged the situation." He could have said anything to show the jury he understood the gravity of his mistake. But he didn't. His pride, the same pride that had caused this disaster, would not let him. "No," Price said, his voice defiant. "I stand by my actions. I was following my training to secure the scene." Preston let the answer hang in the air, a stunning admission of unrepentant arrogance. He walked back to the plaintiff's table. "No further questions, Your Honor." It was a mic drop moment. In that single defiant answer, Kevin Price had sealed his own fate and the fate of the city he worked for. He had looked the jury in the eye and told them that, given the chance, he would do it all again. He confirmed for them that he was not an officer who had made a terrible mistake under pressure, but a man who fundamentally believed his authority was more important than another person's life. The jurors' faces were like stone. They had seen the video, and now they had seen the man. And in their eyes, there was no doubt left at all. The closing arguments were a formality. After a mere 2 hours of deliberation, the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The jurors filed back into the box, their faces unreadable. The foreman, the retired Navy chief, handed a slip of paper to the clerk. The clerk handed it to the judge, who read it, his expression unchanging, and handed it back to be read aloud. "In the matter of Washington versus Price and the city of Jacksonville," the clerk began, her voice echoing in the silent room, "on the claim of unlawful seizure in violation of the Fourth Amendment, we, the jury, find for the plaintiff, Imani Washington." A soft gasp went through the courtroom. "On the claim of false arrest, we find for the plaintiff, Imani Washington." Imani squeezed her eyes shut as tears began to stream down her face. Mark Preston put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We will now read the damages," the clerk continued. "For compensatory damages, including emotional distress and reputational harm, we award the plaintiff $4.3 million. The number was staggering, but the clerk wasn't finished. "And for punitive damages, to be levied against Officer Kevin Price and the city of Jacksonville for its willful and reckless disregard for the plaintiff's constitutional rights, we award the plaintiff $15 million. The courtroom erupted in stunned murmurs. $19.3 million. It was a thunderous verdict. A number so large it was clearly meant not just to compensate, but to punish and to send a message. The jury hadn't just sided with Imani, they had adopted her outrage. They had sent the message Preston had asked for, a message so loud and clear it would be heard in every police precinct and city hall in America. Imani sobbed, not for the money, but for the overwhelming, crushing sense of vindication. The jury had seen her, they had heard her, and they had believed her. Justice, real and transformative, had been done. The verdict was more than a legal victory, it was an earthquake. The $19.3 million judgment sent shockwaves through the city of Jacksonville and beyond. It was a headline-grabbing figure that forced an immediate and painful reckoning within the city's leadership and the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office. The message from the jury was unequivocal. The old way of doing business, of protecting bad cops and ignoring systemic problems, was no longer acceptable and would come at a devastating financial cost. The first domino to fall was Officer Kevin Price. Less than a week after the verdict, following a rushed internal affairs investigation that suddenly found the courage to state the obvious, he was fired from the JSO. His career in law enforcement was over, his name forever linked to one of the largest civil rights verdicts in the state's history. But the changes didn't stop there. Facing immense public pressure and the looming, even larger lawsuit from Robert Miller's family, which they settled out of court for an undisclosed but reportedly massive sum, the City Council approved a sweeping overhaul of police training and policy. They brought in outside consultants to rewrite the department's protocols for interacting with other first responders. The new policy, which became known informally as the Washington Mandate, was explicit. At a medical emergency scene, the senior paramedic, or EMT, was in command of patient care, and any interference by law enforcement outside of a direct threat to life was grounds for immediate disciplinary action and potential termination. The story of Imani's ordeal and the staggering verdict became a case study in police academies and paramedic training programs nationwide. The body camera footage, once a piece of evidence, was now a powerful educational tool. It was used to teach new recruits on both sides of the divide about the critical importance of communication, respect, and a clear understanding of roles at an emergency scene. It showed in stark, undeniable detail how arrogance and a rigid adherence to authority could escalate a situation with tragic consequences. For Imani, the aftermath was a whirlwind. She was hailed as a hero, a champion for first responders. She was invited to speak at national EMS conferences and was instrumental in lobbying the Florida state legislature. A year after her trial, the governor signed the First Responder Protection Act into law, a bill that codified many of the principles her case had brought to light, creating specific legal protections for medical personnel against obstruction or interference while performing their duties. Imani stood beside the governor at the signing ceremony, a reluctant but powerful symbol of change. She eventually returned to work as an EMS supervisor. The money from the settlement afforded her financial freedom, but she couldn't imagine doing anything else. The ambulance, the adrenaline, the profound privilege of being the person someone called on the worst day of their life. It was a part of who she was. Things were different, though. When she arrived at scenes, police officers treated her with a new level of respect, almost a reverence. They kept their distance. They offered help. They deferred to her medical judgment. Her battle had created a safer environment for all of her colleagues. She had fought the war so they could do their jobs in peace. In the quiet moments after a storm, reflection offers a clarity that the chaos itself can never provide. Looking back, it becomes possible to see the intricate web of choices and circumstances that led to that sun-drenched confrontation on the bridge. What drove Officer Kevin Price? It wasn't simple malice. It was something more insidious, a deep-seated insecurity masked by a rigid, aggressive interpretation of authority. Perhaps he came from a background where strength was equated with control, and any challenge, especially from an older, experienced black woman in a position of expertise, was perceived not as a difference of professional opinion, but as a direct threat to his identity. He had been trained to see the world as a series of threats to be neutralized, and in his mind, Imani's refusal to comply made her just another threat. His badge was not a tool for service. It was armor for his fragile ego. If Miller had been able to pause, to listen, to see the dying man on the ground as a person instead of a prop in his own power play, the entire tragedy could have been averted. If his training had emphasized de-escalation and interagency respect as much as it emphasized officer safety and control, he might have become Imani's greatest ally on that roadside instead of her worst obstacle. And what of Imani? If she had been less confident, less forged by the pressures of her past, would she have backed down? If she hadn't possessed that core of steel from a lifetime of service, perhaps she would have made the easy choice to show her ID, gambling with a stranger's life to avoid a confrontation. The victory was born not just from the injustice of the moment, but from a lifetime of preparation that had unknowingly armed her for that specific fight. Her refusal was not an act of spontaneous defiance, but the logical conclusion of a career spent prioritizing life above all else. The incident reminds us that true courage isn't about being confrontational. It's about holding fast to one's principles when it is most difficult, when the personal cost is highest. It's about understanding that sometimes the most powerful action is a firm, quiet, and unshakable no. This story is a testament to the fact that one person's unwavering commitment to their duty can expose and correct a systemic flaw, creating a legacy of safety and respect for thousands who follow. What do you think is the most important lesson from Imani's story? Have you ever witnessed a situation where someone had to choose between doing what was easy and doing what was right? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and please support our channel so we can continue to bring you these important stories.